Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Great Hall. I'm Hayley Eber, Acting Dean of the Owen S. Channon School of Architecture here at the Cooper Union. Tonight, I have the great pleasure of welcoming two very special guests for our lecture this evening in collaboration with the Architecture League, Billie Tsien and Jennifer Dempsey from Todd Williams and Billie Tsien Architects. I first discovered the work of the studio as a graduate student at Princeton, where I often encountered Feinberg Hall on my walks across campus. It's a small brick and copper tower designed by Todd and Billie in 1986, the same year they established their practice. This modest structure, accommodating only 40 students, always struck me as understated yet confident, exuding a sense of permanence as if it had always been there. Like much of their work, every material was thoughtfully chosen and every texture reflecting its intrinsic value. At the heart of the studio's philosophy is the belief that architecture is an act of profound optimism and a service that reflects the values of the public's institutions. The studio designs buildings that seamlessly blend into their surroundings, showcasing the craftsmanship behind them while prioritizing the experiences of those who inhabit them. Matter, light, texture, detail, and most of all experience capture the essence of their building practice. The firm has been especially recognized for its precedent-setting designs for visual and performing arts institutions, such as the American Folk Art Museum in New York, the Phoenix Art Museum, the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, the US Embassy in Mexico City, the renovation of David Geffen Hall at Lincoln Center, and most recently, the Obama Presidential Center in Jackson Park, Chicago, of which Jennifer Dempsey is one of the project team leaders. Their dedication to this work has been recognized with many national and international citations, way too numerous to mention here this evening. Still, I'll highlight just a couple. The National Medal of Arts from President Obama, the 2013 Firm of the Year Award from the American Institute of Architects, and the 2019 Premium Imperial presented by the Japan Art Association. In parallel to her practice, Billie is a devoted participant in the broader cultural community while maintaining an active academic career. And it is thrilling to have both Billie and Jennifer teaching a fourth-year option studio here at Cooper Union this semester. Billie's generosity extends well beyond architecture. She currently serves as a fellow of the American Academy in Rome and has been inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the National Academy of Design, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. In 2021, Billie was appointed by President Biden to the US Commission of Fine Arts, becoming the first Asian American woman to serve as chair. She is steadfast in her mission to create a better world through architecture and support a broader and more diverse cultural landscape. I would like to conclude by sharing the studio's philosophy as a precursor to the work they are about to present. We see architecture as a profound act of optimism. Its foundation lies in believing that it is possible to make places on earth that can give a sense of grace to life, and believing that this matters. It is what we have to give. It is what we leave behind. We wrote these words a number of years ago and believe in them even more deeply today. We measure the value of our work by the quiet pleasure of the lives lived in our buildings. We want to solve problems and we want to transcend solutions. We strive to work with thoughtful integrity to create buildings that will last and be loved. We want to leave good marks upon this earth. This work comes from many voices. Following this lecture, my esteemed colleague Deanna Agrest will moderate a Q&A. And just a brief note that continuing education credits are available for attendees. There will be a QR code available when you leave. And this program is supported in part by public funds from the New York Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council and by the New York State Council of the Arts, as well as by the Architectural League members. So with that, I would like to welcome Billie and Jennifer on behalf of all of us. Thank you.
So I'm going to start out this lecture, and I have to say, I feel as if I'm in a room full of friends. So it's really such a deep pleasure to be here. Um, Jennifer and I decided to do this lecture together, and I'm going to do the talking, but she's going to end up doing the talking. Um, because we are both obviously women who've entered the profession, but at very different times. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I became an architect. It was pretty much by chance. Jennifer is going to talk about how she became an architect. And I think not only are we going to talk about why we started, I think through this lecture, we're going to talk about why we continue, um, because it's a long journey. And the reason it's titled Unfinished is because neither of us feel finished. I remember many years ago meeting a woman who's probably the age I am now. And she said, well, I went to finishing school, but I got out and I still don't feel finished. And I looked at her and I thought, how could you not feel finished? You look finished. Well, I understand now how she feels. Uh, Feeling unfinished. Both of us feel unfinished. This is a long path. So we're going to talk about 5 projects. As I said, each of us will start out separately talking about how we got to where we are at this very moment. Um, I will talk about the first 4, and Jennifer will really talk about the Obama Presidential Center because she's been so deeply involved in it from the very beginning. Okay. Um, do you want to stand or sit? Okay. Or do you want to? No, no, we decided we were going to stand. I forgot. I forgot.
I grab this and I'll stand.
Okay. Um, so I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and I grew up in a suburb in New Jersey and always felt, as I've said, culturally very American, but psychologically very Chinese. So I've always felt as if I've never quite belonged wherever I am. And I think actually that's probably a pretty good position for somebody who's interested in architecture because you never feel embedded in the place where you are. You always feel a little bit outside of it. And that gives you maybe the distance so you can think about how you might change it and shift it. But I found myself on the West Coast, and I actually wanted to be a graphic designer, but somebody said, well, why don't you go to architecture school? It's the same thing. It wasn't, but there are straight lines and stuff. But at that time, there were these people, modern architecture in LA. Those were some of my teachers. So that's Tom Main looking impossibly young, as also Frank Gehry, Fred Fisher, Robert Mangurian, Eric Owen Moss, um, Greg Hodgetts, and Coy Howard. So they were all my teachers, all male at the time, still are, I guess, but all male teachers. And the head of the school was a man named Charles Moore. And he made a kind of very eclectic architecture, but his great gift was he taught us to see. He taught us to look at everything. So we went on field trips that ranged from going to Magic Mountain to the largest miniature golf course in Los Angeles to the Neutra House. And what I learned from that is that you you need to look outside of your own world, and you always need to be looking really with peripheral vision. So on my first day of architecture school, this is a facsimile of what we did. They said, take a piece of paper, put it behind your back, hold it, and tear an elephant. And it's like, okay. And the- I remember the teacher said, this is what being an architect is like. You have a vision and you have not actually any control of how that vision is going to be um, brought to life, but you try to, with your sense of what it is that you want, work in a way that is in some ways blind. And I thought, this is for me. I like that sense of both wanting control, but not being in control. But while I was in school, I felt very much as if I could never be an architect because there were two sort of paradigms. One was um, Howard Rourke and the person who would blow up their building if it were in any way not exactly what they wanted, or there was one could be a diva. And actually, this is stand in for Zaha Hadid. And I felt like I don't know if I could either be Howard Rourke or a diva. And so I felt very insecure about what architecture was. Um, but I think one of the things that I realized over time was life can be very complex. And one of the great skills is learning not to go in a straight line. So the idea of tangents and accepting a condition, in many ways, I think it's a condition that is particularly true to the lives of women, that they are not straight lines, that it's not a kind of single focus that ends in a perfect circle, but is instead a kind of exploded material from that circle. But that you learn by not by accepting the complexities and then learning how to flow around them, flow with them. And I think that's a great strength that we bring as women to the practice.
I want to start by saying I'm very happy to be here standing next to Billie, who I've worked for and with for the last 8 years, and very happy to be speaking with you. So thank you. This is me as a child. I grew up in a place called Grays Lake, Illinois, which is about 45 minutes north of Chicago. And that proximity would be really formative. It's where my love of architecture started. For me, it was the glittering beauty of the city at night, and more specifically, the idea of living in an apartment, which was the height of glamour. From a young age, I would cut floor plans out of the Chicago Tribune of condos, and I would draw my own. They were always 3 bedrooms, one for me, one for my brother, one for my parents. And they took up the entire rectangle of the piece of paper because it was completely interior. I was only thinking about looking out through the windows at the beautiful city. The other exciting thing about cities for me was that the idea that so many different lives could be collapsed on top of each other, but also separate. You could have your own little world, but you could see and have access to other worlds. So after high school, I moved to New York to study architecture. I started at Pratt in 2002 and inevitably fulfilled my dream of living in an apartment, probably for the rest of my life. As a quiet and methodical person, architecture school with no right answers was an adjustment, but also really gratifying. And New York was exciting, but often challenging. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, and I'm not very comfortable being squeaky. But I loved both design school and New York because they pushed me to be in the world in a way that I aspired to be: active, observant, bolder, but I could still be interior among the action and feel like I was part of something bigger than myself. So, what does it mean to have been educated as an architect, train, become, and now practice as an architect in the last 20 years? My personality, I think similar to Billie's, doesn't match the image of the architect that has been celebrated historically and culturally so far. And like many others, I've had to find my voice and my comfort level in exercising it in the context of what I want to achieve. We know currently women don't stay in the profession at the same rates as men and don't reach leadership positions in the same numbers. But I think that will shift, and I think it is shifting. I think it starts with academia. We already see strides. Student body populations are largely 50-50 in terms of gender, and we know more women are deans of architecture school than ever before. And also, if you look at people entering the profession, NCARB reports that 1 in 3 new architects is a person of color, 2 in 5 are women, which is an increase from where we were 5 years ago. So that's progress. The reality of working is not that of a singular genius that we've all internalized, but it's really one of collaboration. And the ability to sensitively and effectively communicate, I think, is one of the most valuable skills you can have as an architect, and not just visually. I'm grateful to work with people who think that that's important and navigate the practice with grace and humility to support a vision of the profession that doesn't look the same now as it did 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. And I recently became a mom. This is my daughter this summer, looking out at the Obama Library off to the far right from a hotel room, from the window of our hotel room. And now I recognize the accomplishment it is for those who did this before me to add motherhood to my identity and still maintain, the demands of the profession as an architect. And I'm now in multiple communities, not just looking out the window myself, but watching my daughter look out the window onto a world that I want to work for her. And the Obama Presidential Center, for me, is one of those projects where I feel incredibly lucky to be a part. And actually, I was thinking, we were both at the job site about a month ago, and it was on that visit that I realized how unique it is. Just the job site itself feels really good. As a woman, even just as a person or an architect, where you feel like you sort of stick out like a sore thumb on many construction sites, it really felt not like that at all. It felt very natural and inclusive, and that's a testament to the owner and their partnership with the construction management team. But I think that is something really great, and hopefully we can all work to make that be the new norm in architecture.
I'm impressed that you knew so early that that's what you wanted to do. That's something new. So there are sort of qualities that I think we always aspire to in the work that we do in the office. And the first one is interiority. So this idea of the importance of the interior space really drives so much of the work. We always say we start from the inside out. And this you probably have seen before. It's Lalibela and in Ethiopia. And it's these rock-hewn churches. And I always love them so much because you can't really see them when you're far away because they are the surface of the ground. So it's granite that's been carved into, the form has been made and then carved into from the outside in. And so it is very much about an interior space. And then these two images I think actually are very related. So anybody who's sort of grown up or has a child, I guess most of you have all grown up, but has probably seen this great book, Goodnight Moon, where all of the objects in the bunny's room are sort of one after another called out. And as you say goodnight to each one, you really get an idea of the bunny's life. So, this idea that the detail of a space can tell you about a person's life, I think, is very, very powerful. And this is a painting by Carpaccio, who's a sort of northern Italian painter. And it's this person looking out, contemplating the death of, I think it's Saint John, can't remember. But what struck me was when I saw this painting are the all the little objects that are in the room, and they tell you about the person because there's an astrolabe, so he's a scientist. There are books, so that he's an intellectual. There's a dog, so that he's a humanist. But it's also a red and green room. So my thought was that Clement Hurd, as he was thinking about working on this book, must have gone back to Carpaccio and picked up some of these red and green colors. And it's really kind of, they're kind of paired to each other. Okay, interiority. Another important quality that we always think about is touch, what the hand feels. This is one of my favorite stairways. It's quite strange, and it is in the house of a sculptor named Morton Esherick. And first of all, it's a kind of amazing spiral stair that he made himself. And you go partway down, and if you change your mind, you go back up again to a mezzanine. But at the time, we were allowed to walk down the stair. And I remember holding on to the railing and feeling the railing, the smoothness of the wood. And all of a sudden, it became cool. And I couldn't figure out why it was cool. And I looked closely and I realized that it was an ivory tusk that was let into the wood. And so that sense of touch, it could look the same, but that sense of touch tells you something that your eyes can't necessarily discern. So that's also a very, very powerful driver, I think, in the work that we do. And so what your hand feels, this is a railing in my own apartment, what your hand feels is something that's as important as what your eyes see. I think we also are believers in reticence. So it's not only about what is said, perhaps it's more importantly about what is implied. And so this was an image of an exhibition that we designed for Noguchi lamps. And part of the exhibition was a series of fiberglass screens. So when you came in, you didn't actually see the detail of the lamp, you just saw the shape of the lamp. And you just saw the sort of essence of the lamp. So sometimes I think you start to know more, you become more curious when not everything is revealed. This was the American Folk Art Museum. And I think what we try to do with this project is make a facade that had the texture of the hand, but didn't necessarily open up to tell you what was inside. You had to come inside to find out. And finally, I think what drives us is the belief that humility, uh, which just seems to be a strange thing to be saying as I'm standing in front of you, talking to all of you, but really, I really believe that as architects, we are here to serve. I remember being in architecture school, and one of the critics came in. It was clear he had been drinking and coming in from maybe a very bad client meeting. And he just sort of roared out in the middle of the studio, architecture is nothing but a dirty service profession. And, you know, when I was a younger architect, I remember thinking about what he said and thinking, am I really here to just do what other people tell me to do? But as a older architect, I think, yeah, actually I am here to do what people tell me to do, but to try to do it in a way that they couldn't imagine. So this is the first of the 4 projects, and they're quite small. And we're trying to talk about work that's relatively current. So this is a bench that was a collaboration between an amazing cabinet maker named Stephen Eno, who, if you have the need to design or make any beautiful piece of woodwork, tables, credenzas, go to see Stephen. And Jennifer Luce, who's an architect in San Diego. And this was a bench for a renovation that she did of a space that became the Mingay Museum in San Diego. So this is not actually what we did, but it's something that I've always loved because it's a combination of being beautiful and ugly. And it's a Chinese root chair, and it's made from these sort of natural roots. And I remember seeing one of these and just thinking, how amazing it was because it was so sort of sinuous and so clearly from the ground. So these benches, and you can see actually in the background, there's a George Nakashima bench, but these benches are in the lobby of the Mingay because Jennifer designed a very low, simple pine bench, but it needed something that would help people who might have um, knee problems, mobility problems, something that they could use to push themselves up with. So these are burls that are part of Stephen and my contribution to Jennifer's bench. So this is Stephen's shop in Paterson, New Jersey, and he collects some hoards many different kinds of pieces of wood. And he had this gigantic wooden root ball hanging from the ceiling. And we could never, I'd always go in and see that thing hanging from the ceiling. And so now this was a chance to use something of that root ball. So it was very, very exciting. So here's Stephen with a couple of the prototypes for pieces that he cut from that root ball. Using a laser and then carefully disassembling it, we found pieces of the root that would act as a kind of armrest or something that you could use to help yourself up. And then he polished them. We sat against them. One of them was actually cast in bronze because it was used on an outdoor bench. And here are the 3 prototypes, the metal one and the wooden ones set along a bench. The second project is under construction. Isaac Southard, who I think is here, and I think some people from our studio are here, has labored over this project along with David Later and Jessica. It's a tiny, tiny project. So if the bench was super small, this is quite tiny. We're working with Michael Van Valkenburg, and it's at the entrance to Brooklyn Bridge Park. So what it is basically toilets under a big roof. And there's also a concession stand where food will be sold. And then Michael planted, this is his drawing, ginkgo and honey locust trees all around it. So the coloration around the trees right now and in the fall will all be golden. So you can see it's a very, very simple plan. It's 3 pieces. There is the concession stand, the bathrooms, and then a column, because holding it up is a very large canopy. And we took the canopy color from the ginkgo trees that are surrounding the pavilion, and then using these small penny tiles of slightly varied colors of yellow are tiling the underside. So this should be done, I think, in about another 2 or 3 months. And this is the office out for a trip to look at the framing and the beginning of the tiling of the underside of the canopy. This was a project that was finished at the New York Philharmonic Lincoln Center, and we were involved with uh, doing all of the public spaces. So all of the lobbies, all the people where people, all the places where people went became the spaces where we did our work. This is a still from the original version of West Side Story. And it's also an image of the neighborhood where West Side Story actually was supposed to have occurred, which was a neighborhood that was torn down under Robert Moses's aegis, and Lincoln Center was built. And when it was built, it was the sort of epitome of high modernism. It's a Harrison and Abramovitz building. Philip Johnson had a lot to do with the interiors, and it's all clad in a sort of travertine. That sense of a sort of, I guess, unidimensional material, unidimensional culture, created spaces that in our own lives today felt very cold and unwelcoming. So it was our task to try to make these places feel as if they could be places where more different kinds of people could feel welcome. But there is a very, very strong sense of formality in Lincoln Center, and it was very hard to uh, sort of subvert that sense of formality. But the kind of new leadership felt that it was very important. So this was in the summer of 2024. An artist named Mimi Lien did this piece where she took AstroTurf and created a whole new topography out of the courtyard of Lincoln Center. So it was with this kind of spirit that we were asked to reimagine what Lincoln Center might be. The idea of glamour rather than the sense of sort of sobriety, which I think the earlier Lincoln Center exuded, was very, very important.
On the faithful.
And so
Inside the Pantheon. A total of 40 to 60,000 petals each.
this was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life. And I was there with Mary Margaret Jones at the Pantheon at Pentecost. And they drop in rose petals from the opening in the sky. And you look up, and at first it's just a few rose petals because it's tongues of flame. And then it becomes a waterfall of rose petals. And I think we both started crying because it was so incredibly beautiful. So thinking about this as one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life, I thought maybe this could be something about bringing back that sense of sort of glamour and beauty to Lincoln Center. So these are drawings that were done in the studio. They are a series of petals, and they're the drawings that are the three different tiers of Lincoln Center. And so at the very, very top, there are the most intense petals, fewer petals, and fewer petals as you get down to the ground. They were done by a company that we've worked with called Liara Manet, and they're made in China. They are made by laying out tiny little sort of pebbles of acrylic material, and then they are run through a needling machine, which then adheres the backing to the tiny little pebbles and flattens them out. So these became the hallways of Lincoln Center. So as you're walking to go into the performance space, you walk past these flowing petals. And the carpet was done by a group called the Scott Group. And there was one man. So these are lines that are hand drawn on our drawings to be irregular. And there was one man who in Grand Rapids, where the carpet is made, he decided it was going to be his job to draw these, to put on these yellow lines. So he retired this year, and he's come to Lincoln Center to look at his lines running through the carpet. So every project for me is a series of stories of the people who made the project. And I have to say, this is a very personal story because these are lamps that we commissioned from our son, Kai Williams, and his partner, Chen Chen. and they are industrial designers. And so they designed these lamps, which are also an idea of petals that have reflected light. And working with Fisher Marantz, they made these shapes, which are in themselves don't hold the light, but are only there to reflect the light. And they tried a number of different techniques. So they went and they did alabaster, but it was too heavy and too fragile. And then they tried to do hammered brass, but it was too expensive and too heavy. So finally, they ended up going to a company that makes musical cymbals. And so it's spun metal, so it's much, much lighter. And then they, by cutting irregular shapes from the actual cymbals, they're able to make these folded, softly curved planes that actually became the petals that are reflecting the light. Walking through the doors into the performance space, we also designed all of the fabric. So the fabric is also in 4 different scales of petals, large to quite small, with a dark blue background. And what they're doing is replicating this idea of falling petals so that they're the most red and full of petals in the back. And as they move towards the front of the stage, they become bluer. So this is the next to the last project before Jennifer takes over with the Obama Center. It's under construction in Mexico City. I think it will be done in a year, but we're not exactly sure, but I would say 2025. Mexico City is an incredible city, very, very large, very, very spread over, and it feels almost impenetrable. But if you start to look at an aerial view of Mexico City, you see that it is punctuated by interior courtyards. So one of the things we wanted to do with our project was to try to make it feel as if it were connected to the architecture and the culture of Mexico and Mexico City. Our site was in an area called Nuevo Palenco. It's an area that's growing. There are a number of museums there. There's one by David Chipperfield that's very nearby. So it is an irregularly shaped site. And the building is very, very large. Mexico is the second largest trading partner of the United States. So it's one of the busiest embassies in the world. It's 1 million square feet. So it was really huge. But it is surrounded by a very intense landscape and a series of courtyards. So the courtyard that is you first see in red is the primary courtyard, and it's at a piano nobile, so it's at an upper level. But then there are a series of courtyards within that courtyard, and then series of courtyards that are at grade. So it's a very, very punctuated building. Because the sun is so high in Mexico City and so intense, it's that main courtyard also has a sculpted roof over it, which brings in light and allows rain to come in because there are plants underneath. We did a number of studies that looked at how light would come in. And this is a rendering of the courtyard. It is the primary gathering space for all of the people who work there. It allows them to have an outdoor space that is extremely protected, but it will also become a public space when there are various events that happen in the embassy there. This is a construction shot done relatively recently. And we also looked at the stone of Mexico, and certainly with all of the sort of incredible sort of stonework that you think about when you think about the indigenous work of Mexico and also the contemporary work of Mexico. Stone is a very, very powerful and very important material. So we used a kind of sandstone, first looking at travertine, but then eventually going to a sandstone because it's a color that is akin to the warmth of the sort of yellows and sort of reds that you see in Mexico City. And the building is, I think, at this point, mostly clad. There's a very powerful, very intense art program here. So this is a sort of entry for people who are coming in, Mexican nationals who are coming in to get visas. And this is actually a piece by, thank you, Ed Ruscha, where he's starting from a galaxy, and then the last word I think is dot. We were very interested in the sort of artwork of the that we saw in the hotel by Legarreta, and there's a lot of traditional, also Mexican metalwork, which involves shaping and really sort of making these sort of pinholes. And so we decided that we would think about adding a screen, because this is essentially a very, very boring building. It's all offices and all the windows are the same. So in order to both give a sense of character to the facade, but also to act as a sunscreen, we designed this rather complicated sunscreen, which has been made out of bent metal and cast metal. It's all cartridge bronze. So this is the casting. Here you can see a combination of the bent metal pieces and the cast pieces. And then this is a very rough construction photograph. And this is not the right color, but you start to see the intensity of the metal. There's also a very, very big wall that runs around all embassies, but we just didn't want to make it a wall. So we started to look at Mexican textiles and then made it out of concrete with small black panels in it, and then large pieces of the sandstone. So it becomes much more of a tapestry than a solid wall. We looked at the tile in Mexico because there's incredibly beautiful tile, and then used very common cement tile in all of the bathrooms in these different patterns. We also looked at the colors of the power of the colors, and going back to Leora Manet, made these color block wall pieces that run the entire length of the corridors, so that you can simply cut a doorway into this fabric, but it gives you a sense of pattern and perhaps kind of memory of where your office might be, if you can ever find it in these miles and miles hallways. And then finally, we took some of the embroidery and translated it into mosaic tiles for some of the dining areas. So that's still underway. Hopefully it will come forward soon. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the Obama Center before I turn it over to Jennifer, and I would have to say that 2025 might be 2026. It was a competition, and I think one of the things that we did in our competition was probably think less about the building and more about the meaning of a building. And the first question was, can a building represent a vision? And often we use words to help us stay close to our original ideas. And the two words we came up with were ennoble and enable. And we felt that the inauguration of President Obama was an ennobling moment for the nation. But we also felt that what he really wanted to do with this presidential center, which is what he's dedicated his life to doing, is to enable other people. So beyond the sense of just standard storytelling, which is what traditional presidential libraries do, we also believed that it was very much about story making. So these were actually the images that were part of our competition. So they were kind of fairly direct and hand-drawn. We also said that rather than a singular building, it should be a campus and should be a plural building. And then there are always sort of touchstone images. And this one image with the carved letters is actually a small stone that I bought when I was in Ethiopia. And I didn't care if it had been made a week ago or 100 years ago. You can hold it in your hands and you can feel the texture of the writing, and you know that there is a message there. That's been a touchstone for the design of this building. Also, the idea of a kind of beacon. I mean, there's the sense of the Underground Railroad, but also giving light out to other people. And then with the hands coming together, because it's not the story of one people, it's the story of many people. It's not the story of one person, it's the story of standing on the shoulders of many people and being shoulders on which other people will stand.
So the site is Jackson Park on the south side of Chicago. And it's the site of the 1893 World's Fair. To the right is the Science and Industry Museum, which is the only building that remains. To the left, outlined in red, is the site for the library, which is approximately 19 acres. It was originally bordered by Cornell Drive to the top of the image, which cut it off from more parkland. And then there's Lake Michigan beyond that. So one of the first things we did was close that roadway to knit back together the park. The goal was more park, fewer barriers. Olmsted, I forgot to mention, designed Jackson Park. And one of his ideas was that the park was a democratic institution, meant to have a lot of activities. We wanted the same thing. And we did that by embedding the project infrastructure into a topography that could support new activities. So this is the 19 acres. There's a lot of parkland. There's a production garden, a sledding hill, a playground, to name a few. And then the park comes up over the tops of all the buildings, except for the tower, which is the white square there on the left. The site also contains about 200 geothermal wells. This is a net zero project and LEED Platinum. And at the heart of the campus, where the architecture really reveals itself from under the landscape, is a plaza, a public plaza. And that's the entry point to the site, faces the community. There are 3 buildings around that plaza. To the right is a library, a lending library, a branch of the Chicago Public Library, on the roof of which is a fruit and vegetable garden and a teaching kitchen. The forum in the center of the image will be home to the Obama Foundation offices, and it's also public. This is a public building. There will be an auditorium, classrooms. So all the programming of the Obama Foundation will take place there. And to the left is the Tower building, which houses the museum, which will describe the life and life's work of President Obama. The idea is that this is not an insular campus, but it connects to the community through programming. This is the lower level. So all 3 buildings go underground and are connected underneath the plaza. Landscape courtyards bring down light to the lower level. The tower anchors the north end of the plaza. It rises about 12 stories above the ground, and it's a structural concrete building. So concrete walls slope out at the bottom, in at the top, and they're basically held together by slabs that connect to concrete cores and act as diaphragms. So I'll focus mainly on the tower for the rest of this talk. Not moving forward. Thank you. Oops. Um, so our process of design is iterative. As you can see, these early study models explored how the form of the tower and the articulation of the facade could get at those early competition ideas that we had, that of a beacon, hands coming together. But we wanted a form that would be strong and monolithic. And at the beginning of the design process, President Obama asked that the building be more iconic. He wanted not only a civic center for the south side of Chicago, but a landmark that would sort of let that community have visibility as it's separate from the majority of the tall buildings in Chicago. And he was very engaged in that particular phase of the project. The sketch on the left is actually his black Sharpie markings suggesting some ways that he thought we could shape the tower. So that was thrilling, frankly, but that he would give feedback like that. So how can the surface of the tower reveal itself to be deep and varied, like stone that's carved into, but also retain that elemental quality and strong form? These sketches show different zones of articulation. There's areas of texture, areas of porosity, moments of carving or excavation out of the mass, and areas of glazing or transparency. So we were always considering the part relative to the whole, each of the elements balanced compositionally as you move around the tower. So this is a section through the tower. The blue indicates the actual exhibition levels of the museum. And those levels contain historic artifacts that, you know, have requirements from the National Archive that they can't be exposed to light. And they also have stricter humidity and temperature controls. So the program is informing how we can introduce openings into the tower. The top and bottom floors are where we have the most transparency, and those are the public floors. The other thing is that we had to consider blast requirements. There was extra security provisions for a building like this. So all of those things really had us conceive of this as a solid, something solid. But that solidity was practical. At the same time, it was also about meaning. This is representing a president, but also an institution. It's about history. The tower is embedded in a park. It's built down into the ground. It's designed for permanence. So as you can see in this rendering, openings were carved out strategically where they were needed on the interior. And the majority of those clear glazing systems are at the top and bottom. The material of the facade is predominantly granite from New Hampshire. This is a photo of the quarry. We wanted a stone that was light in color, but would also have a lot of variation. And you can see in the quarry walls, the large figuration that runs through it. It was also unique in that there's sort of two stones that exist on top of each other in this quarry. Tapestry has the larger figuration and veining, and then there's a quieter, more recessive stone that also exists. So that variation meant we also needed to make sure there wasn't problematic variation in terms of its structural properties. So this image is showing where we were working with the quarry to mark out areas of stone that we would test for compressive and tensile strength. there's a lot of high wind loads in this building since the tower is very close to Lake Michigan. And so this is a mock-up. The tapestry is on the left. The kitledge, which is the recessive stone, is on the right. So the tower is going to be clad in the tapestry. It's more expressive, more iconic. And then the other buildings are going to be clad in kitledge, which is more recessive, more in keeping with the landscape that comes up over the top of those buildings. We wanted the facade to have parts that were polished, like the previous image, but we also wanted parts that would be rough, texture that would be visible at a distance. So these are some precedents that we looked at early on. And we knew the tower needed to be a monument, but also a building you inhabit. And texture can help break down the scale of that facade and form. So it had to have a relationship to the park, to the plaza, to a person, to a hand that's going to touch the wall. And as other work in this lecture has evidenced, our studio often looks for materials to show their natural irregularity or highlight imperfections that happen during a material process. So I'll talk about two places on the tower that we explored that texture. The first, on the sort of right corner in the foreground, is an area we're calling the bas relief. And it began as an idea of markings on the surface, kind of like furrows in a farm field. We explored a lot of ways to achieve that from the stone we were using. So we looked at the edge of cut blocks, the quarry skins, or the cut-off pieces that have drill marks and saw cuts. We looked at different processes, machine cutting, blade chopping, like how you make curbs, hand splitting. We wanted something that would feel like the remnant of a process. And ultimately, these became bars of stone that are epoxy doweled onto our large stone panels. And we wanted a texture that would also catch the sunlight in different ways and would change as the sun moves across the building, which you can see in these images. We were able to achieve. This is another mock-up we did in advance. In the end, these were actually done by hand. And that was, to our surprise, the most cost-effective way to do this. So how this works is that there's a line drawn along one side, and somebody breaks the stone along that line with a chisel. And then he turns it over, and he does the process in the opposite direction on the other side. And so you get that uneven edge, and it basically takes about a half hour for each of these bars. Here it is on the building a few weeks ago. And the last part of the tower I'm going to talk about is the upper corner, which we call the screen. So this also came from another way of thinking of how we could carve into the facade, maintain that form, but also lighten the solidity and sort of excavate material out of that corner. The envelope of the building actually steps back behind this wall, which allowed us to have more freedom for this to be a structural element. We didn't have thermal requirements to think about. It does provide sunshade. So the facade that's behind it is the facade of one of the most prominent public spaces of the tower, which we call the sky room. And it has expansive windows to the south and west, so that gets a lot of direct sun. So it does, the screen helped us mitigate that. Initially, on the left, this collage shows that it was conceived as an abstract pattern that was based on text that was sort of cut up and reconfigured. Similar to ancient marks in stone, like cuneiform, we were looking at text. Ultimately, the president and the rest of the team saw the opportunity to use actual words, something that would have real meaning. So these words became an abridged version of the speech Obama gave on the 50th anniversary of the Selma March. So here we are starting to study the actual letters. The screen is 83 feet tall and about 60 to 70 feet wide. It wraps the corner, so there's two sides. And so each letter ended up being about 5 feet tall. And once we knew this was going to be letters, we started working with a graphic designer, Pentagram, to help us look at how this lays out on the building. We looked at different thicknesses of stroke, different sizes of letter, varying the text. The font was based on the Gotham font, which of course was seminal in Obama's campaign, but that had to evolve because of structural and material requirements that we became aware of as the process moved along. So we had that idea, and then we had to figure out how to build it. The first idea was to use stone, like the rest of the building, but you can see this meant sort of an armature to support the stone, and that was not really the sculptural quality we were looking for. So ultimately, we used ultra high performance concrete, or UHPC, which has stainless steel fibers, and allowed the form and structure to be one and the same. So this is a profile of basically one of the letter strokes. And we were thinking about it on a number of scales. The legibility of the text changes depending on whether you're inside or outside the building. This is an early study of what it feels like from the inside, where sometimes you're 6 feet away from the letters. Obviously, the letters are reversed and they're large so that you can't really read a phrase. It's more abstract. And we wanted this side to feel more like a beautiful sculptural element, something polished. And the curvature also allows interesting things to happen with light across the surface. This is a close-up shot of that inside face. The tapered side of the profile faces the interior. So the larger face faces the exterior, and that's also the top of the mold for the UHPC. So as it cures, bubbles rise to the surface and you get a rougher texture, which if this is 130 feet on the ground, it can handle. And you can't necessarily read the text or the speech as a whole, but you see phrases, you see words. It wraps the corner, so it would be difficult to find a vantage point where you can read the whole speech. So this is the room that we call the sky room, to give you a sense of what that will feel like to look out through the letters. The ceiling volume is low at the edges to draw you to those windows, to look out over the south side of Chicago where Michelle Obama grew up. It's meant to be a contemplative space. This is an early section showing the screen in relation to the building. So the spaces behind it, we have the sky room at the top. There's also a mechanical floor at the bottom, level 6, so that the screen also allowed us to hide louvers, very large louvers behind it, exhaust and intake. We also wanted to figure out how to connect this back to the building in a way that you wouldn't see those connections. So we were working to get the lateral connections, of which there are three heights, back to the building as far away from glazing as possible. The whole thing is dead loaded. So it comes down to one of the structural concrete walls. On the left, you can see the moment diagram, which is a little scary of how that wants to act in bending and the forces we needed to counteract. So stepping back again to how this evolved from a graphic, which doesn't have to support itself, to something physical, we needed a way to connect the letters. And Pentagram gave us this idea, which has precedent in typography, which is of ligatures, where two letters share a stroke. So you can see with those A's on the left, we basically used horizontal ligatures to connect letters. And this allowed us to have an armature to continue load paths down to the bottom, as this was all dead loaded. We were also taking into consideration the reality of getting these panels to site. So we had to think about what could fit on a shipping bed, a truck bed, and that really defined the width of these panels because each panel needed 2 load paths. There was a lot of negotiation. So going back and forth between our structural engineer, our graphic designer, we're talking about shifting letters, sometimes a couple inches to get a load path to work, but also make sure the legibility of words, sentences was still readable. So this is an image of the fabrication shop in South Bend, Indiana. These are fiberglass forms. The letter molds repeat. So basically to make a panel, they reuse the letter forms and for each scenario have to create unique connections between them and then blockouts to create each panel. This is a mock-up of the screen being lit at night. Because the facade is sloped and the wall behind it is vertical, the back panel of this mock-up had to be movable so we could really see how this would act in reality. Here's an early visualization of how that would feel at night. And here's the tower as it is a couple weeks ago. Stone is going up quickly. And a view looking over the park towards the north to downtown Chicago. Flyover the entire project.
So our last image that we're showing is an image of hands. This was President Obama at his farewell speech. And then, of course, this is skeleton of a hand. Because in the end, I think it all comes down to our own sense of humanity, how we hold each other, how we touch each other. It's been a very difficult week, as we all know. And I just wanted to end by something that I thought was quite hopeful. Short quote by Colson Whitehead, the writer. And he said, be kind to everyone, to each other, make your art, and resist power. So we do that by holding hands. Thank you.
It's amazing work. Thank you for a beautiful, beautiful lecture. I like the combination of Billie's part, full of histories and personal experience of life, what I call the Sen of Tsien. And taking us through this trip, although brief, apparently because they're more recent projects. But anybody who has followed the extraordinary work of Todd Williams and Billie Tsien know what lies behind it. And certainly Jennifer is not here for nothing. I mean, she's brought another voice, which is the voice of new action, of engaging with what's there and bring it to fruition, which is an extraordinary thing to do for, as we all know, how hard it is to get anything done and built, and even more so, the level of work that has been presented. I was going to actually, I made so many notes when I watched this PowerPoint, and I never write about current, colleagues or contemporary architects. But as I was making notes, I was making thoughts, I said, oh, it's like, looks like I'm writing, but of course it's not for me to speak about your work because you did it beautifully. So the hard things, you explained everything so well, but still there are many things that to be talked about and maybe expand a little bit or dig into it. First of all, thank you for bringing the women question in the beginning. If yours was hard, maybe you don't know mine. But as you said, it's good to know that things very slowly have changed over time. And hopefully, as we have to be hopeful, they may change more. I'm sure they will. And it's interesting that I paid a lot of attention to your principles, of which I'm not going to recite here, but you did it very well. And you demonstrated all this thing about the detail, materiality, the detail. I'm missing some, whatever. But I think you did beautiful work going from the very small scale to the larger scale. And I'm glad of course, you're going to put the Obama Center at the end, although the Mexican embassy is much larger, I suppose, enormous. So a real challenge. And there's one of your principles that, while I see in many things, I'd like to discuss a bit. So maybe they run through many of the projects instead of one. And then I'd like to focus on the Obama Center, a fascinating project, beautifully done, which is reticence. And so you talk about reticence as one of the principles, and you explained, and we know that reticence is about taking a back look and being discreet and not being obvious. But the work you look speak volumes, actually. It's not very reticent, I think. And I'm saying this in a good way. I think that when you go, for instance, the petals, I love that story because we all fix, I can completely engage with the idea of having an experience and then marking it for you can't wait to make it somehow, reproduce it. And those petals that then became part of the Giffen Center and certainly enlivened it, it's something that's full of stories, full of personal thing, and it speaks volumes, not only because it tries to, pay homage to this experience and bring this memory back to life, but even that. So I think that the question how the stories, and it's preparation for how you make, can the building represent a vision? And a vision can't be too reticent, particularly if you want to make changes such as Obama and his administrations have done, and others before him. So I think that I'd like to discuss this with you both. I know Jennifer might have a different perspective, seeing it maybe in a more recent experience. And I know your work has always had a lot of reticence, but I think in these, particularly in the small projects, I would say the, yeah, the petal is the one that I was more touched by, really, um, for that reason. And then going to, in all your projects are, even the Mexican embassy is full of these things at a different scale. So I'd like if you could talk a little bit about that.
Um, I think that just to talk about reticence, I think it's true. I think one of the big struggles, and Jennifer showed that. I'm going to talk about the Obama Center for a minute. She showed that image of all the models. That was torture. It was torture because, first of all, I don't believe that you start out with the idea that you're going to make something iconic. Something becomes iconic on its own. It has nothing to do, I think, with the intention. In fact, I think if you intend to do that, probably it's not very iconic. So when somebody came and said it should be more iconic, it was very, very difficult because it meant that we had to design from the outside. And it is really not the way we design. And so we made all of these forms one after another until we finally got to a form that I think the foundation and he felt comfortable with. But that was a place where it was not about reticence. It was about the desire to sort of do what somebody tells you to do. And I think that that was one of the most difficult design assignments. And I would say, and I say this as I watch the building go up, that it slightly scares me because it is a building that can potentially be hated by a lot of people because it's all present and it's out there and it's not the way I think of our work usually being. So
But-
it's a kind of it's an assignment that was not a comfortable assignment.
I love what you said, but I think maybe, and you can follow that, I think maybe the balancing between the park and the role of the park and having the other buildings almost disappeared, which is an incredible reversal because usually what is the main object, let's say, of a presidential project after its presidency is the library. So these reversals, as you explained, was more called by the Obama position in this. But I think that it is, one of my notes was precisely that the tower becomes an object, and knowing your work, it becomes like a monument. I think that they having placed it in the campus and having these other buildings be integrated into the park and have the park have such a strong presence, I think is that interiority in a certain way from outside, although it's because it's a park. I don't know how you think about that, or maybe you thought that way, because I was puzzled by the campus and precisely this, all of a sudden, this makes further emphasizes the monumentality, although it's not super monumental, but the object they are supposed to the rest.
Yeah, I mean, as Billy said, the tower didn't exist in our first conception or first entry, competition entry. So it kind of happened, I think, bit by bit. Proportions changed, it got stretched and pulled and then carved, and but I think we use the same principles that we do in the rest of the work on that form. We just had to sort of excavate it differently and think in a different scale. But there were sort of there's whole worlds in that tower. Even just a faceted window in a sloped concrete wall is a very complicated coordination process structurally. So I feel like the way of working that spirit is still there, but it sort of got pulled out of us.
You know, I also think that at a certain point, even though we didn't feel comfortable with the idea of iconic, we also recognize that people will be coming to the Obama Center to pay homage to a presidency, to a time, to a series of beliefs, and that they needed to come to something that felt that carried the importance of what they wanted to see. So it it was difficult, but also understandable why they wanted to have something. And I'm not sure whether he actually said it, Obama said it, or the foundation said it, but it was a desire to sort of give something to which people could pay homage.
You know, the tower fascinates me because, and that's why that's brought the reticence in. I think it's so brilliant the way I think subsumes all your principles, and in particular, the inscription, because it's an inscription. I know you call it a screen, but it's an inscription, and using text there to for this particular present, for this particular history, where text is essential to the struggle, to the history of the fight against racism, discrimination, everything we know. And the word comes alive there. And I think it's about freedom. So the way you've done this as detaching it from the building, and each letter in each word become an element that's there, that's freed. It's freed from the solidity of the building and the way it's even built. You know, the detail fascinates me because it makes it like the power of the word, the power of the word. And when I saw the sky room, that picture, that's like the best because they're like, it's like the history and phenomenological experience are together in that one moment, that one room, looking through the work, through the letters, because they're looking at a horizon, which is like the optimism, looking to a future, looking to a new horizon. And so I think that the way that's done is brilliant in bringing the vision of this thing, and together with the granite, the work of the body of this person working by hand on this granite, the labor, and that puts in front the importance of labor of all the people involved in doing that. And I could go on, but I think that fascinates me in terms of, I don't know if I hit it right or you were thinking about any of these things, but where I am sure you must have been, I don't know.
You know, I'm just going to quickly reflect on the labor of Jennifer and the labor of the man who cut the blocks
Yeah.
by hand. And I was thinking about how it is architecture is this incredible weave. You know, I can sit here and I can tell stories about the building, but I could never figure out how the letters go together and how what the structure is. And you sat there and you did it. And
Yeah,
that's Jennifer's story. So I can tell a story about whatever, but this is Jennifer's story. And we need all of those stories together in order to make something happen.
absolutely.
And we needed that man who has the ability to chop the stone to make that happen. So, I mean, there is an incredible sense of unity that can be expressed in architecture that at this moment feels hopeful.
Beautiful. I don't know if maybe there could ask some questions for, maybe we have time for a couple of questions from the public.
I would also say that I wouldn't hold it against anybody if they decided they actually wanted to have dinner. So,
Are there any questions? I can't see the light.
Hi. Thank you both. Thank you, Jennifer and Billy. That was a great presentation. Um, I was just wondering, the Obama Center project is just, it's so complicated and there's so many different parts to it. And I'm not an architect or studying architecture, but I'm just curious, like, where do you start, like physically? Like, you know, did you start with the tower because that's the most visible, or iconic, or did you start with the landscaping or the inside, the outside? I'm very curious about that process and how you go from one step to the next step. So thank you.
Well, I mean, it's so, you sort of have to start so zoomed out. I mean, we're often thinking about the experience that we want somebody to have. So it does start a lot from the interior. But you're constantly having to go back and forth between scales. And you do that for, you know, 6+ years. And and it is extremely complicated, and you work with a lot of consultants and a lot of people on the team. And just over time, it, we didn't know it was going to be this in a way. So it doesn't feel so daunting at the beginning, because it's sort of, one foot in front of the other in a lot of ways, but you are constantly testing against that first idea, that first model, and always testing back against that as you work out a detail, how stone comes together. So you kind of zoom into these little worlds that exist in the project, and then you have to zoom back out again over and over and over again.
It's like being a mom.
Is there one more question, maybe? No? Okay. Thank you all so much.